Hello and welcome to PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm your host, Ian Hartitz. Happy Tuesday. We got some cool stuff to talk about, as always, on this edition of the PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. I'm joined by none other than PFF's own Dwain "The Rock" McFarland. Dwain, we've made it past the Pro Bowl week. There's one more football game separating us between now and the USFL season. How are you dealing with it?
I'm good. I didn't pay a ton of attention to Twitter over Pro Bowl weekend. But apparently, I guess there's a lot of people bitching about it. I did what you should do if you don't like the Pro Bowl. You just don't watch, and you also don't read any tweets about it. Like you just move on. I did see your tweet of the old Odell Beckham dance. I forgot about that. That was one of the most awesome things ever. Next to the mascot, that was funny.
Everyone's saying, "Oh, look at OBJ like dancing away from his teammates." It's the Pro Bowl. That clip right there was better than anything I've seen on field from that tragedy of a game over the past 5 years. I haven't watched the Pro Bowl in I think 10 years, Dwayne. I spent this weekend sleeping in. I bought a Nintendo Switch, so I was all over that, playing Zelda Ocarina of Time or whatever. And yeah, very light football weekend in the Hartitz household for once, my friend. So on this edition of the podcast, we basically want to go through three categories. Not going to be all that related, but Dwayne and I are doing a bunch of cool stuff all throughout the week. We want to take the time to point out some things that, hey, maybe don't need 60, 90 minutes of attention, but 15, 20 here, you could imagine. So Dwayne, let's kick things off with a look and preview of the tight end free agency landscape. I'm going to share my screen here. Both of us know some articles that you can all find on pff.com in recent weeks about the tight end landscape. Dwayne and I kind of had a different approach of going about it. So basically, I looked at the different situations. Dwayne looked more at the different players. And by God, what are the chances we're on the same podcast to marry these two principles? So starting things off, when we went over the wide receiver stuff on this podcast a week or two ago, kind of explained it, but the idea of available targets is going to be what I think kind of drives a lot of this. So I went through, looked at all the potential free agents, not all of whom are going to be leaving their team, but just as it stands right now, unrestricted, exclusive right, whatever it is, took away those targets and looked at which teams have the most room for available opportunity. They are, as you can see on this screen, the Cardinals with 446, then the Buccaneers, Packers, Chargers, Falcons, Dolphins, Cowboys, and Titans. There are some other teams not that far off, the Jets, the freaking Commanders, like we gotta call them that now, Texans, Bears, and Chiefs. And then we got some other depth charts like the Saints, Patriots, Lions, Jaguars, where it's like, okay, don't have that many available targets, but there's enough of a lack of depth around there to imagine someone coming in and taking over. Dwayne, the first thing before we get into these exact fits though is I just want to point out how damn atrocious past high-priced free agent additions have been at the tight end position. It's usually not good. If you're changing teams, that means your original team didn't like you enough to really pay up what they needed to, so it makes sense that this group of players isn't great. But my God, man, highest priced free agency deal since 2016, Jonnu Smith, Austin Hooper, Hunter Henry, Kobe Fleener, Trey Burton, Jimmy Graham, Jesse James, Martellus Bennett, Ladarius Green, Tyler Croft, and if your ears are not bleeding yet, Rhett Ellison, Deion Samson, Jimmy Graham twice in the same list. Gotta love that. Dwayne, with a lot of these positions, not every player has a price point, so we're not fading anyone just to fade them. But in general, man, I think if we just looked at free agents as a whole over the past 5 years, particularly at tight end, stay away from them if it's, at all possible.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it does depend on landing spot. Like, for example, Jonnu Smith and Hunter Henry are two of the biggest names on here, and they landed on the same damn team, right? Austin Hooper goes to a team where he lands there with David Njoku, who they had spent a first-round pick on. Now Stefanski was coming in, so he was not the guy that had drafted Njoku. And then they draft another guy, in Harrison Bryant. So it's just, I think there are some different nuances so I don't know that I would just have a strict rule just to avoid them, but I think you definitely need to pay attention to where do they land, and is it very likely that they're going to be rotating and sharing time, because that's just not something that we want to deal with at the fantasy. Really at any position if we can avoid it, but like we know it's something we're going to deal with at running back. But when you only have to have 12 in a 12-team league or 10, in a 10-team league, it's a onesie position. You're really just trying to get one of the guys that isn't in, one of those splits. Otherwise, I mean, you're just basically betting on a touchdown every week. So I do think that it makes a little bit of a difference depending on where some of these guys land.
With that in mind, top 5 landing spots, in my humble opinion, mostly based on those available targets, but also got the quarterback in the depth chart. Cardinals, Chargers, Giants, Seahawks, and the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Let's start off with the Cardinals here real quick because, Dwayne, they are losing not only Zach Ertz, but also Max Williams, who was, of course, their starting tight end in the first 5 games of the year before he suffered a torn ACL. Zach Ertz, upon joining the Cardinals, was the tight end 4 overall the rest of the way. I mean, I realized a lot of this did come with DeAndre Hopkins out of the picture, and we had a split there where Kyler Murray was out of the picture as well. But Dwayne, like before this podcast, I was doing some handy dandy work on Excel and all this shit. And anyway, with looking at age and stuff like that, and as we can see, here on this handy dandy chart, like tight ends, even age 30 plus, man, we're still seeing plenty of higher end contributors, right, relative to running back, wide receivers. So if Ertz comes back to Arizona, man, and they don't make this huge kind of splash upgrade at wide receiver 2 or receiving running back or something, I think Zach Ertz could be looking at a rather inexplicable kind of second half career renaissance.
Yeah, I think so as well. I mean, and when you look at Ertz, I mean, he'll be going into his age 31 season. So, like, he's kind of a baby compared to, and we talked about this even on a few of these tight ends on the last podcast. Like, you got these guys at age 36, 37, that are still having these seasons. So, Ertz is still relatively young. We know how he wins. He's not, like, trying to burn people on wheel routes or seams. Like, he can work those things, but really his game is understanding how zone concepts run, which, oh, by the way, the NFL runs zone on almost 70% of their plays. So, mostly what tight ends face is going to be zones. You're against linebackers. You're against safeties. Not necessarily the best cover guys anyway. And a lot of it is just based on being able to understand, what's happening in front of you. Like looking at Ertz, looking at Gronkowski, looking at even Jason Witten in his latter years, Antonio Gates, Tony Gonzalez, all as they were kind of fading into the sunset, if you will, but still being productive in fantasy. Like they weren't elite athletes anymore, but we saw them continue to be able to be an impact on their team. And I think a lot of it comes down to the quarterback trusts them. They know they're going to get a good matchup. And it's, a lot of these are shorter targets, right? They're in the 5 to 10 yard range. So, you get a high catch rate. You can throw into tighter windows, all those sorts of things. And so I think that when you look at Ertz, like he really fits that profile to me. I think Gronk does too. We don't know for sure what Gronk's going to do. Like, it sounds like he may be leaning towards retirement. But if he chose to come back and play, I totally think Gronk can play even with a different quarterback. Obviously, that would be different not having, Brady. It would impact him some. But I think that he's a good enough player, still young enough that he has some years left.
Great point on the types of routes. I know we're going to get into that more here in our second segment on this episode. And it's like, probably shouldn't be criticizing Ertz and these tight ends for not being able to run certain types of routes that, let's face it, tight ends and these types of players aren't running all that often anyway. So always remember relative to what we're dealing with here. All right. After the Cardinals, I do think the Los Angeles Chargers could be fantastic. I don't need to tell any of you guys about what Justin Herbert brings to the table. But then you look at this offense. Jared Cook, 35 years old. He's an unrestricted free agent regardless. I wouldn't think he played well enough last year to really earn the benefit of the doubt coming back. Either way, we need to see what happens there. Also, Steven Anderson and even Donald Parham is an exclusive rights free agent. Now, the exclusive rights free agent, it's very easy for them to bring these guys back. All they have to do is extend the qualifying offer, which is a 1-year league minimum contract, and that player will not be allowed to negotiate with another team. Really weird, Dwayne, just like reading that aloud. Like, doesn't really sound fair exactly to the player, but that's how they're going to do it. So with the Chargers, man, like this was a team where you saw the tight ends as a whole usually putting up some decent numbers. I mean, last year they collectively scored the 9th most fantasy points in the league, but because they were always splitting reps, Cook, Parham, and Steven Anderson, Cook was the best one at tight end 20. So if we somehow lose these tight ends and Mike Williams maybe doesn't come back, there is a chance, Dwayne, for a certain someone to emerge as a number 2, maybe number 3 behind Eckler and Keenan Allen. Pass game option for Justin Herbert. A lot of assumptions going on here, but are there any tight ends in particular?
I thought you already nailed down that's going to be Josh Palmer, and that's just our stance.
that's what we're putting our foot down now. We're not changing it regardless of what happens.
Flag plant right now.
So yeah, like aside from Gronk, because I hear you, he is in your we
can set Gronk aside. And here's the thing. So the way I tiered, the guys in the research that I put together, really was just which guys could probably go be a secondary target, like maybe not the primary read, but the secondary target pretty much on any offense. And the answer came down to Gronk when you look at the data. But then like The next level was they might be a secondary target, but they could also be a really good third target, right? And so I think that's where Zach Ertz comes in. I think Dalton Schultz, Mike Gesicki, and they're all different players. Schultz is more like Ertz, really going to win more underneath, going to run a lot of the hitch routes, not going to run a ton of seam stuff. He may run it, not going to get targeted a ton. But then if you really want more of a field stretcher, and I think this also depends on what else they do on the outside end. We talked about this team, the Chargers, whenever we talked about receivers as well, and talked about who could give them that vertical element. Well, another way to think about that would be looking at tight end. So if you got Keenan Allen really working inside the hashes, you don't maybe necessarily and it's underneath where a lot of Allen's targets come. They're typically his ADOT's usually around a 10 or somewhere right under that. And so looking at a tight end, you could think about using a tight end that could get a little more vertical, and I think that was probably their idea with Jared Cook. And if you think about Joe Lombardi's the offensive coordinator, he's always used more of a vertical tight end. If there's been a tight end that's been active in that Saints offense when Lombardi was there, now we know Sean Payton was play calling a lot, but it's a lot of the offense really comes from the Saints, especially the passing game. Even Jared Cook said that last offseason. He was like, most of the passing game's coming from the Saints. The run game is really coming more from the Kyle Shanahan style. Mm-hmm. So when you think about that comment, Gesicki, might be a good fit as far as really trying to stretch the field a little more vertically than these other guys. He's not a good run blocker, though. But this is not a team that's really wanting to run the ball, right? It's one of the most pass-happy teams. No matter what the game script tells them to do, they're going to be over the league average as far as dropping back to pass. So Gesicki would be one that I think could be interesting because you could pair him in a different way with what you have with Keenan Allen, and then that also opens up what you may want to do on the outside, as far as what type of weapon you may want there.
And the thing with Gesicki, as I brought up ad nauseum throughout the entire season, whether people wanted to hear it or not, was just the fact that he really does play more as a slot receiver. But honestly, that's kind of like Jared Cook too. I have their kind of snaps by position in their offense last year. Jared Cook last year, 305 snaps in the slot, 108 out wide. We're looking again well over 60-70% of his snaps there. Mike Gesicki a little bit more extreme. The guy couldn't even play 100 snaps at the position that he is being told to be. But I do like that call. What about David Njoku, Dwayne? I saw that.
I think he's a similar. I like him too. I think he's a similar player, honestly, to Gesicki. He can really stretch the seam, and he can give you that speed. Doesn't have the greatest hands, not necessarily the most versatile route runner.
When you look at these workout metrics, though, Dwayne, I've been jerking off these things for the last 5 years.
I know. Yeah, he brings a spark, if as you would say.
I see what you did there.
But and Evan Ingram too. Evan Ingram is also an athlete. I think with David Njoku, though, we like the fact that there's still more of an unknown with Njoku. It's we've never fully seen him unleashed. He showed some flashes in his second year, third year, ended up in this big rotation. Now, could we potentially see him land in a pass-heavy offense where those, athletic traits could really be let loose, if you will? And so, I graded him a little bit below Gesicki just because we haven't seen him do quite as much, right, as what we've seen from Gesicki. But I think he's in the same mold. Can definitely be a seam stretcher. Definitely could give you yards after the catch on the crossing routes. Not like a great player, if you want him to run all these comebacks and slants, not slants, these comebacks, and deeper routes breaking back to the quarterback. But if you get him on a crosser, get him on a slant, get him on a seam, those sort of things where you basically just say, hey, get the inside leverage we need you to have, and then just run away from the guy. I think that you can get that out of David Njoku, and so you could definitely get some big plays.
He has recently been saying in the media how much he wants to re-sign with the Browns, finish his career in Cleveland. Was there not a trade request rumor going on last August before the year started?
I thought so. All this stuff, though, right now is there's so much of it is just we have no clue. And it's what's a player going to, a lot of times, these players don't want to rock the boat anyway. They don't want to come out and say they want to leave their team. They don't want the fans to completely turn on him. He's already basically a first-round bust to most people in Cleveland, so...
Now, you do see every once in a while, these players have a random big game against an opposition, and that opposition then goes out and gets that player coming around. David Njoku against those Chargers back in week 5, Dwain.
Yep.
7 catches, 149 yards, and a tutty. A man can dream. After that, I do have the Giants as a possible contender. Really good offseason coaching moves being made here, Dwain. I know PFF's own Mike Renner was saying that just based on the whole staff construction, that you could argue the Giants have had the best offseason among anyone. Obviously, we need to see how it plays out over the next 3-5 years. Coaching changes, just like draft classes, always kind of ridiculous to be giving them a grade as soon as they happen. But just with the Giants in particular, having Evan Ingram be a free agent, like, okay, Kyle Rudolph is there, but he's 32. It's a new regime. They can get out of that contract pretty easily if they want to. We saw things that Brian Dable did with Dawson Knox, in Buffalo. Situation where we're seeing, Kadarius Toney's name floated out there. Who knows what Sterling Shepard's health is going to be like by week 1. I mean, Daniel Jones, Dwayne, whether or not he's a starting quarterback there, we have seen him for stretches, not, for the most of the second half of last year. We've seen some stretches of him putting up some solid fantasy numbers. If we can get a featured tight end with the Giants, man, they're going to have a chance to be a top 2 option in that passing game. And, at the position, that's all we can ask for sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, like you mentioned, there's just so much going on right now with the Giants offense. We really don't know who's going to be back. Supposedly Barkley could be low-key on the block. You already mentioned, Kadarius Toney. So who knows what they'll do with Sterling Shepard, a good player, but just can't ever stay on the field. So yeah, who knows who's going to end up landing here, but very interested. To your point, you get Brian DeBole coming in. We know that he's one of these guys that's really been a chameleon. Like whatever his talent is around him, he's rotated to that, and he's
what a
really
concept!
Tried to,
what a crazy concept!
And when he first came to Buffalo, he was really a run heavy historically, kind of coach, and then he was that way early on in Buffalo. But then as they brought in Cole Beasley, then you go out and you add, even before Emmanuel Sanders, you had John Brown. You start trying to give, Josh Allen some different weapons. You draft Dawson Knox. Obviously, you traded for Stephon Diggs. Those sort of things we saw. I remember watching the Bills do all those things, and it was the year after Josh Allen had been so terrible. And I'm thinking, how's this going to work? How's Josh Allen going to utilize all these guys? And I was just worried, not just about Josh Allen's accuracy. I was like, how much is this offense really going to drop back to throw? And it showed you that really their offseason moves totally gave you, if you read those as the tea leaves and you watch what they did in the draft, they told you what their hand was going to be. But right then when you get these other, you don't know, because you get these other teams like Denver that'll go out and they get all these weapons, and then they're like, yeah, we're gonna run the ball as much as we can, despite all these. So every coach is a little bit different. There's a lot of different nuances. There's a lot of different variables. But yeah, tons of targets. For somebody to jump up and grab. With the Giants, we'll have to see who's there.
Similar kind of situations going on with the final 2 teams. Seahawks, where it's just yeah, I get it. Metcalf and Lockett are going to get theirs. God forbid some of those Metcalf trade rumors come true, though. Then we got to look at both Gerald Everett and Will Dissly being unrestricted free agents at the moment. I maintain, man, it didn't work out last year, obviously, because Deshaun Watson couldn't play football. But if we could give Watson or Russell Wilson just one every down tight end that's even somewhat good across the course of an entire 17-game season, I think they scored 10 touchdowns every single year. Basically, the last time we saw that for Russ was when Jimmy Graham's corpse back in 2016 managed to flirt with that number himself. So just remember, Russell Wilson, last year 25 passing touchdowns wasn't quite the same, beast as we've seen in recent years. That was the first time since 2016 he failed to throw for at least 31 scores. So don't be afraid to go back to well with Russell Wilson, man. Do you see any of him at those Pro Bowl skill competitions, Dwayne? Those things are actually reasonable.
That's the best part of the Pro Bowl is actually that stuff. And so I didn't get to see Russ Wilson, but I was keeping an eye on mostly the Cowboys stuff. But no, I didn't get to see Wilson. But as far as the Seahawks go, I would like to see, I think for them, because of the way they like to run their offense, O.J. Howard is the name that's the most intriguing to me, just because he's good in the run game as far as blocking, so he can be a true every down tight end. Everett did get to that point where he was out there for most of the routes at the end of the season, but he's never really been known, right, for, being that pass blocker. So a lot of times you would still see Will Dissly rotating in, but Howard would be that true two-way threat that was a good blocker in college. We saw him be a good blocker early in his career in the NFL. And then, like, if he could get to a situation where, like, they trust him enough, like, he could be a really good fit, for the Seahawks. And sorry, O.J. Howard, I hate to send anybody to, like, the 40 play per game offense, but, like, it may have your name on it.
O.J. Howard, along with C.J. Uzomah, man, 1 year Achilles recoveries, just like our guy Cam Akers. Love to see these guys overcoming.
Well, and with Howard, with Howard, he can also give you like that vertical, field stretcher as well. I know it didn't happen last year, but like up until last year, like the ADOTs 12.3, 11.6, 10.1, 12.7. So I mean. Yards per reception 16.6, 16.6, 13.5, 13.3. Like, so Howard, until this past season, and he was hardly used, like, there was a reason he was the number 19 pick, overall in 2017, I believe that's when it was. But I think we've got all these guys from that year, actually. So
going into last year, man, it was like Gronk and O.J. Howard, I think, were number 1, number 2 in yards per target among like qualified tight ends since 2017. It's unfortunate he had the injury, and then it's unfortunate he had to play behind Tom Brady and his freaking BFF. But yeah, Howard changed the scenery. Absolutely love it. Still just 27 years young. And hey, man, maybe it is back in Tampa Bay because they are my final team on this list because of losing potentially Chris Godwin, Rob Gronkowski, Leonard Fournette. That's 3 different players with more than 80 targets, and potentially O.J. Howard out of the picture. The Cameron Brate contract has been pretty hilarious over the years. I mean, they've been able to get out of it for a long, long time, but he has stayed around because he signed like a $40 million contract, and you're like, oh, it's Cam Brate. Like, what are we doing here? And the way they've structured it is like, yeah, look, he's got base salary like in excess of $6 million over the next 2 years. They can save almost all of it if they want to just cut him after June 1st and, only getting $500K in dead money. We'll see if they decide to do that, because that was the problem for O.J. Howard, early on in his career before Gronk. It was them continuously splitting his work with Cam Brate, and that's why, landing spot and usage is so, freaking important here for fantasy purposes, everyone. So with the Buccaneers, Dwayne, I mean, it's going to matter a lot. Again, what do they do with Gronk? What do they do with O.J. Howard? And then who's under center? With all that said, the whole thing behind Mike Evans is wide open for someone to come in and take that number 2 pass game option.
Yeah, for sure. And this is one of the teams, like this team and then the Giants, like we really have no clue like what it's going to look like as far as all the skill positions, with Chris Godwin potentially being gone, Mike Evans getting older. Like, I know we talked a lot about Evans in the slot last week, but Cameron Brate, like if all of a sudden you have O.J. Howard and Gronk gone, I mean, even he could be something, right? That could be like a punt play tight end at the end of a draft.
All right, everyone, that's going to wrap up our tight end conversation. Before we get going, I want to give a quick shout out to some of our sponsors, especially those at DraftKings. So we changed the ad up a little bit, but thank you to everyone that pointed out that, no, Ian, it's actually not 1-800-HOPANY, it's Hope NY. So I'm going to take the massive L with that. Hope NY for a New York, phone number. Makes sense. Not Hoppany, which is a word that doesn't exist. So we'll work on that in the future. And again, thanks for those reaching out. But anyway, everyone, now the moment
I prefer Hoppany, but
well, now everyone's going to remember it. So maybe you're welcome. I'm not apologizing. What am I doing here? The moment we've been waiting for since September is finally here. In honor of the big game, DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of the Super Bowl 56, is giving new customers 56-1 odds on either team. Bet just $5 and get $280 in free bets if your team wins. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app. Use promo code PFF and get 56-1 odds on either team. Again, bet just $5 and get $280 in free bets if your team wins. That's promo code PFF at DraftKings Sportsbook, an official sports betting partner of Super Bowl 56. Just make sure you're 21 years old or see DraftKings.com/sportsbook for full list of requirements and state-specific responsible gaming resources. And if you have a gambling problem, call 1-800-GAMBLER. Also want to thank our friends over at Western and Southern Financial Group. While you focus on your roster moves, Western and Southern helps advance your money moves. Buying your first home, planning to start a family, wondering how to make your money grow. Western and Southern's playbook of life insurance, investment, and retirement solutions helps you rest assured on game day. Team up to understand needs and address goals with a game plan built just for you. Get started at westernsouthern.com/PFF. Dwayne, you've been doing some very cool work over the past week, 2 weeks. I don't know, man. You're pulling Excels at 6 a.m. You're texting me at 1 a.m., talking about Justin Jefferson route highlights. It's fantastic. I love working with you. And now we have some cool-ass charts to go over. Let's start things off with some of your takeaways on NFL route usage, because I think, as you put it in your tweet, Dwain, kind of makes sense that if we want to sit here and pretend to be able to evaluate wide receivers, we should probably know what routes they're actually being asked to run at the NFL level.
Yeah, I was just, as I was sitting there just really watching, players, keeping all my notes, going through our data, I just started, thinking, okay, great. So we see a certain player that every time he's on a comeback route, he wins. Well, how often does a comeback route even get used? How do you weight that information? Right? That may be really great if they can also run, all these other routes that are really important, and it's like just icing on the cake. But how important is it that you can win on a comeback route whenever you look at this, so just to kind of give the lay of the land on what you're showing here on your screen and you're sharing, this is the NFL over the last 3 seasons. We'll start with the top chart. Just looking at, okay, and this is the percentage of targets going to which routes, right? And so if you look at it, obviously there's all at the top, and then to the far right, you got 3 columns: percentage of targets, percentage of yards, percentage of touchdowns. Another interesting column is the one just before that, which is explosive plays per target. So those are receptions that go for 15 plus yards or more. And then the others, you guys can see if you've used PFF, you know what probably most of those mean. A couple of them just CBLC is catchable catch percentage, meaning the ball was actually catchable. Did the receiver catch it? Okay. And then you have drop, right, is if it was catchable, but the receiver dropped it. I know those don't add up to 100%, but there are still instances where it's a catchable pass. The defender gets there at the last second, completely swipes the ball away. So that's not just a contested pass. That's a true batted down pass. So some people, I know if you're like me, you're trying to add these up in your head as you're looking at them. You're like, there's something wrong with this data. Those 2 things should add up to 100%. They're not working. But also the contested catch percentage, not as important, but the CTT, that's important. Contested target, percentage. So the percentage of the time when you throw that ball, it ends up being contested. And there's a lot of things on here that just make sense. But the main thing I wanted to look at is just really, okay, how often does the NFL throw to each one of these routes? And there is a clear leader in the clubhouse, and it's the hitch route. So typically the hitch route, is going to be somewhere between 6, 8, 9 yards. We're not talking about, a deeper version of that, which would be, the curl route. The comeback route is similar, but it's it's breaking to the sideline rather than inside back facing to the quarterback. But the hitch route is 17% of the targets in the NFL. So that by far is the number one targeted route. And then next you have the out route. Typically comes from outside the hashes, so 13%. You get a crossing route. Some people call it an over route. It's sometimes that can be a drag, but typically it's a deeper route. Like if you look at the A dot on this one, it's an 11, and so it's really like, if you guys all have played Madden, or Ian, I forgot, what is it, 2014 NCAA, yes, or 2000, whatever the last season of it was, but it's where you're getting in behind the linebackers, but you're usually in front of the safeties, right? Or one of the safeties is dropping down in cover 3 to go with you, and so that's the next.
Yeah, we're usually seeing Cooper Kupp make like 3 of those catches.
Oh yeah, it's huge in the Rams playbook. Period. Like the cross or the over route is really big in the Rams playbook. That's a great call out. Then you have the slant route. Everybody knows what a slant. That's 9%. Then you get down to the go route. The go route is just a streak, right? Hey, go long. I'll hit you deep. That's the go route.
A-dot spikes to 30, man. Everything we've talked about so far, 11 yards or lower.
Yeah, so that one's 7%, and then you get to the in. Some people call the dig route, right? It's really an in. It's like a squared in route, that's breaking a little bit further down the field, about the same depth typically as the comeback route. So the way a lot of coaches coach it, like you start your break at for the comeback at the 14, right, and you're catching the ball at the 12. The dig route's similar, but you're starting it at the 12, and the quarterback's putting it on you at the 12-yard line. So those are the most targeted routes in the NFL. So if you just take those that we gave, now there's a bunch that, and so let's go to the comeback. We just talked about it. Well, how often is a comeback used? 1.2% of the time. Back shoulder go route, 1.6. It looks great when you're watching it. Like I'm sending Ian clips of these guys like with these catches, and I'm just sitting here thinking about it. I'm like, well, how often does that even matter? Yeah. And also when you look at some of these, If you look at like the back shoulder go, look at the contested throw rate, 45%. Well, what does that do? That makes the catch rate bounce all over on a year-over-year from a year-over-year standpoint.
When you sent me this, I know the goal, everything was to look at the most, used charts and stuff. But the first thing that I think I replied to you with was like, look, this is anyone that hates the end zone fade, the goal line fade. Like, this is the only chart you ever need to show about why. Because, I mean, you look at it, and obviously the yards, like, you're catching the ball in the end zone, so there's no yak or yards per reception or anything. But you look at it, it's got the lowest rate of actually catchable balls that end up being caught. It's got the highest rate of targets that actually end up being contested. And then we have another, again, I believe the single lowest rate, other than jet sweeps, which obviously don't even apply, of the actual contested targets being caught. So everything's harder. They're not coming down with these balls as often. Why the hell do people still run the end zone fade? At least it's now only occurring on 0.5% of the targets. But unless you got prime Des Bryant or Calvin Johnson out there, man, stop it.
Yeah, I mean, look, the wide receiver screen is really, and look, we get it. Like, I know once you get down to the end zone, the field's condensed and all those things. But to your point, like, if you needed a chart just to tell you, like, the end zone fade does not work, it's also got the second lowest PFF receiving grade on this chart at a 61.8. And this is just to receivers. I removed tight ends and running backs. We'll look at them later. I just really wanted to isolate to the receivers. But the key takeaway for me, Ian, is if you look at just all of the routes that are basically at 7% or above, so that stops at the wide receiver screen, right? That 6.8, we'll just call that a 7%. If you put those routes together, that's 72% of the targets are really going to the hitch, the out, the crossing route, the slant, the go route, the in or the dig, and then the wide receiver screen. So really most of the targets are going there. And so as I was thinking through that, I was like, okay, so knowing this data, what if we were to layer that against like these college prospects that are coming out? And let's just take a look, like how do they perform at the routes that we know the NFL is going to ask them to really be able to come in and be able to run the most. Now, each one of them is going to be a little different, right? Scheme matters. Some coaches are better at really, putting their, guys in the right fit, letting them do the things they're really good at. But it's kind of like there's no getting around it. You're going to probably have to do all of these. And so just looking, and so kind of a little bit of context for this chart is really just giving you a heat map of the grades by receiver for each of these routes. Okay, so this is the PFF grade over their college career. This is just not 2021. So I went 4 years back. If any of these guys, none of these guys are 5-year guys, so we're fine. All of these are 4-year guys. And so this is their grade cumulatively across those routes. The other thing that I would say is I'm only looking at the FBS because I haven't had a chance yet to go in and look at a high level FBS versus the FCS to just see, like, is there any kind of difference in the data? Is there anything that we just need to be looking at to really make sure that, okay, are we really comparing apples to apples? My gut says that it's probably going to be okay, but I may just create two charts, right? Okay, here it is against FBS competition, which we could do for FCS schools, like when they play FBS teams, right? And then you've got your true FBS schools. So looking at this chart now, so it's sorted by the right, which is the cumulative. Like, so the receiving grade, this isn't their overall PFF grade, right? Which includes their run blocking and all these other things. This is just their grade receiving cumulatively across the hitch, the out, across the slant, the in, and the go. And so I just sorted it that way. So you get David Bell, who, like, he not only grades out as the top at a 92.9, but if you look at him, he really pops in across all of the key things. So if you look at him on the out routes, he's going to rank 4th. If you look at him on the crossing routes, he ranks 2nd. If you look at him on the slant route, he ranks 3rd. You get him on the in route, I think he ranks, I didn't put this one right, he's 4th. And if you look at the go route, he is 2nd on the chart. Ooh. So not only is he showing up, like, cumulatively really strongly, when you look at that data to the right, if he ran a lot more of any one of these routes, right, it's going to weight into that. So I still wanted to show each one of these individually just to kind of show, like, who's probably the most, ready. So a couple of things, like, and Ian, just jump in here. I know we're kind of running through the slide, but, like, a couple of things popped out to me. One of your guys, Ohio State, like, if you look at Chris Olave, like, the hitch and the out are two of the hugest routes in the NFL. Like, he, like, popped off immediately in both of those. He's number 1 over the last 4 years against all of these guys in the hitch route, 89.6 PFF grade. Then the out route is an 82.9, also first. But then like you work in the slant, which is kind of weird. Like the slant is only a 63.3, but it's over 4 years, right? His dig route is not bad. Like his dig route is fine. But if you look at his crosser, it's a little bit below the rest of these guys. It's not a bad grade, but it's not a great grade. And then if you look at his go route, he definitely comes in as one of the lower ranked guys. And what's interesting, he's the guy Ohio State used really more as their deep guy. Like of all the guys on the team, he had the deepest ADOT.
Yeah, I was wondering with for example, his slant, like, do each of these guys need like a 50 route minimum to kind of be qualifying for this? Because I know more so in recent years under Ryan Day, these Ohio State receivers have had more complete route trees, but that's why like more so kind of under Urban Meyer, like Michael Thomas coming out, those guys and like Devin Smith, those on those Ohio State teams, like they usually had a guy, okay, this is our field stretcher, you're running deep. Michael Thomas, you're running nothing but curls and slants. And there was a period where it seemed like Ohio State receivers were almost like being unfairly pigeonholed as one-trick ponies. Terry McLaurin is another example. Then they come out and it's like, oh, okay, this X5-star do-it-all athlete, they can actually do everything there. So yeah, just kind of talk a little bit about like what did you notice any of these receivers like were super one-dimensional in what they were doing, or was it more so like, no, this was a decent sample size for him?
Yeah, no, I need to go back. So I was kind of trying to finish some of this up. Like I'm working on an article on this today. And again, like pulling all this data together, because the way we have to pull it, the way we pull grades versus actual production and all these things, there's a lot of layers like you have to go through to like get all the data where you need it. So I didn't get to fully sort for this. And we can come back and give folks an update if we need to next week. But like just immediately, going over here and looking at Olave right now, like in his targets versus slant routes, he had 1 in 2018. He had 1 in 2019. He had 2 in 2020. He had 4 in 2021, which is those are really low. So I'll have to go back and like, to your point, like exclude the data points for some of these that don't. I'll have to average these out and see like what can I potentially use as the threshold. The real way would be like to run that and then see how well does it correlate right back to fantasy performance, all that stuff. But this is more of kind of a quick and dirty first pass, at it. So with Olave, like it's probably not anything, honestly, to worry about looking at that overall grade for him, because it would just be something that ultimately we would kick out. But overall, like when you just look at the all together, a 91.3, like he's still in, the top 5. But the guy that, popped off obviously the most was really David Bell. And then look at Treylon Burks. Like if you look at him on hitches, outs, cross routes, and I haven't watched Bell much on film, very little. Treylon Burks I've watched a lot. I've watched every target he's had. I've watched every press snap that he's had, which he doesn't get any because they line him up in the backfield.
Nothing wrong with that.
No, they line him up at slot. They stack him a lot. They do a lot of really, interesting things to help keep him out of these press coverage looks. I want to say, like off the top of my head, like over the last 3 seasons, he only had like 20 looks, 25 looks, something like that against press coverage. So they really keep him out of that. But when you look at it, like the concerning things, right? If you look at the hitch, the out, and the cross, he has not done well in those areas. That's 42%. Of the targets in the NFL go to those routes. So that's definitely, an eyebrow raiser. But if you look at the areas that he does well, it makes sense to you, right? A slant route. Like it's a simple route. Get the ball in the guy's hands. Let him run after the catch. It's an 89.5. It's the second best, on the grid. If you look at him on a dig route or an in route, a 76.2, which is good. And then if you look at him on a go, like, yeah, his sample size against true single or man coverage is small, but when you put him outside and you let him go, like if you look at his size, you look at his speed, 93.6 actually is the number 1 in the class. And I saw him multiple times actually stack the opposing defender, get over the top of him, get past him. Doesn't always get an accurate pass from his quarterback, so that's also a factor. And so when you look at these grades, remember, this is really on their targets. So where the extra film work comes in is going in and watching all of the other plays where he ran a go, but he wasn't targeted, right? And what was he able to do on those plays when the quarterback lets the ball go? Like, what position is he in against the opposing defender?
We got to figure out who is like this class's Jalen Reagor, because I remember that was always the qualifying statement talking about any of his numbers. And I know it hasn't exactly gone well for Jalen in the NFL, but you saw his numbers and they were so much worse compared to a lot of people. It was like, oh yeah, he was the single most unlucky receiver in the country based on catchable target rate.
Yes, and that's always a huge part. And that's where really, grading them on the route running, and the ability to separate. And that's the other layer, like, we can pull into this. Like, how often, when they ran a go or whenever they ran a slant, whatever, were they able to create, at least a step of separation versus less than a step, right? Which would be tight coverage. We have other buckets that you can put it in, which is wide open, which is, 2 or more steps. Versus the opposing DB. But this was really the first pass. It was really just to pull together, these grades. So like I said, Bell, Burks, they showed up to me. And then, like, looking at Garrett Wilson, like, we know he was used on the slant routes. And he was the number one guy, 91.3 grade versus slant routes. And, a lot of that goes along with what you see when you look at Garrett Wilson's underlying numbers, right? When you look at his yards after the catch. And even going back to the chart we were showing before, Ian, with the NFL, like, and where those routes go. Like, if you can pull it up, like, a couple of other interesting notes, like, to think about. One, like, drop rates are really consistent, like, for certain routes. Like, slants, it's, if you look at the NFL over the last 3 seasons, it's 10%, 11%, and 10% in the drop route for slants. So a lot of times we talk about, drops being not sticky and they bounce all over year to year. Well, a lot of that comes from receivers that get a lot of their targets downfield. So if you start looking at post routes, corner routes, go routes, like, the drop rate is a lot more inconsistent. The contested target rate is always high, though. And so that shows, like, the more you deal with the contested targets, right, there's a little bit more of a variable, a little bit more luck comes into play as to what your catch rate is going to be. Whereas on a slant, it's pretty consistent. So that's a route that we could actually use to help compare receivers to one another of, okay, like, how good is this guy's hands? And of course, with a slant route, a lot of times you're letting that get into your body because you're expecting, like, the big hit. The linebacker, the Ian Hartitz is about to blow you up as you, as you look for the ball, and he just puts one in your ear hole. But as far as, like, these other guys, like Drake London, I know is a guy, Ian, and you can jump in here too. I know you've watched some of his film. He's a guy that I know a lot of people really like. And, actually I was chatting with Matt Waldman this past weekend. Matt is an awesome film guru over mattwaldmanrsp.com. Like, if you guys haven't checked out his stuff, like, I couldn't recommend somebody more. Yeah. And the process he puts behind watching these guys. And Drake London is a guy that, like, was not showing up very well for me, in these metrics, and Matt likes him. But as I went back and looked at it, the thing I noticed the most was, number one, like, he really struggled to get over the top of the defender, deep. Like, he could get even to the defender, and he could run the comeback route really well. Any kind of route breaking back to the quarterback was really good for Drake London. And look, it shows up to be one of his better routes. It's his best graded route over the last 4 seasons. It's 84.6, and he's a junior, so that would be over 3 seasons. 84.6. But if you look at these other routes where I was just worried about, okay, in the screen game, a lot of these slants, underneath things where, like, running after the catch, like, he's okay, but he's not great. And so you wonder, like, does he still continue to get those kind of targets on an NFL team that may have a better athlete that they want to use for their space plays? Not to use, like, an overused name, but, like, Deebo Samuel's a space player. Treylon Burks, to start his career, is probably going to be a space player. Not to say he can't give you something in the deep game, but when you look at London, like, in all of these areas that, the NFL really wants someone to do well right out of the gate, like, he wasn't great on hitches. He wasn't great on out routes. Wasn't great on crossing routes. Not good on slant routes. Not good on in and dig routes. Like, his grades are bad on all of these. Now, again, going back and watching all the routes, we may see some different things, right? He may have been open a lot more than that, and his quarterback didn't throw to him. So this is the initial pass. And then Mechie was another one that popped up as being like, wow, like, this guy, I'm kind of surprised. Like,
yeah, Dwain,
should he be coming out?
Mechie and to see Mechie and Jameson down there on the bottom. I mean, both of the Bama guys. I mean, I know we had been told that, and I think we kind of saw it come to fruition where Jameson Williams couldn't quite crack Ohio State's big 3, which is probably going to be 3 first-round picks when it's all said and done. Shout out to Jackson Smith and Najigba moving forward as well. But then for him to go to Bama and just take over the way he did, like, man, you put on Jameson's film and he is fast, man. Like, puts his foot in the ground, he is gone. Like, they use him as a gunner on special teams, and it was just like, basically like one go route after another out there, and no one could hang with this guy. We saw what he did to Georgia in the SEC championship. But do you see this and start to wonder, like, okay, how much of the Bama passing game was Mechie and Williams? How much of it was also the scheme and also Heisman quarterback play under center?
Yeah, so with Williams and with Mechie, I mean, really Williams is the key one, right? I did go back and just isolate to this year, just because his playing time had been so small, right, before this. And so whenever you look at Jamison and you just compare him to 2021 against this same group that we're looking at on the screen, like his hitches would come out to be ranked 5th overall. His out routes would be 7th, crossing routes 5th, slant routes 4th, in routes or digs 5th. So he moved up. And, if you look at him just in 2021, which is really where most of his playing time came from. That's the other thing that I haven't factored in here. Like, we probably need some sort of way like to really give more weight to the most recent grades, right? Against these coverages, because especially for guys that you've seen improve, like where really they've shown drastic improvement. Drake London would actually fit that category as well. Like his first 2 years, he mostly just played slot, so he was a big slot receiver. And then this last year, they moved him outside, and you saw drastic improvement. So like if you look at Drake London, just for his 2021 season, he would rank 4th in the hitch routes, 4th in the out routes. With him, I kind of lean to the bigger data set because he did have more playing time in the 2 previous seasons. But with Jamison, I think you really gotta take a look at his most recent season has to be weighted more because it was the first time he really got to play. And even with George Pickens, like there's just not a ton of data, on George Pickens. Justin Ross was interesting, right? He still came out in the middle here because he's a guy that was huge as a freshman. Like, if you're looking at dominator ranking, breakout age, things like that, like breakout age, like, dude, he was a freshman and was just torching, like, some of the best, defensive backs in college
National
football.
championship, he looked like the best player on the field for stretches.
Yeah. So there's other layers to this, like that we've got to work through. But this was just really kind of the first pass. Like, let's get a high level look at. I know what I like about looking at the PFF grades, like breaking it down by each one of these. Inherently, the way we grade, right? The further down the field you catch the ball, or if you're catching it past the marker, you get a higher grade. So it's kind of hard, like, to just say you don't want to knock a guy too much for just running slant routes. We know the NFL loves slant routes, and a slant route's not going to grade as highly as a comeback route, or as a go route because it's not going to be as far down the field. And you really have to do something with the catch after you catch it to really, to get a better grade, like from a PFF standpoint. So, like, if it's 3rd and 8 and you catch a slant route at say 1 yard beneath the sticks, right? You're going to get like a plus 0.5 on that, and then if you get past the sticks with your run after catch, you're going to get like another plus 0.5. So I like looking at it this way because it also kind of normalizes. It allows you to look at all these guys against one another. And again, it's not perfect because this is on targets, and like some guys get more targets on these routes than others.
You can check out all that and more over at pff.com. Dwayne's going to have some articles up in future weeks, but PFF Draft Guide, big board, plenty of that goodness. And I know on your Twitter, Dwayne, at Dwain McFarland, you tweeted out at least some of the route takeaways. Always a good follow. Apologies to the YouTube audience. My computer went 0 dark 30 on me about 10 minutes ago, and I've just been staring at a black screen. But you know what, Dwayne? I can still hear you. You can still hear me. We will continue on, and we'll do it live. Why the hell not? So last segment I want to go through, everyone, is just a quick, Super Bowl preview between the 2 quarterbacks. As we know, this can, really just go towards deciding basically any matchup, regardless of how big of the game it is. So why not go 12 rounds, title fight, see who comes out on top. I looked at 12 different categories just to try to get a good idea between Burrow and Stafford, which one really comes out on top when we look at who is the most overall complete quarterback. So first things first, in round 1, I want to look at who is best in stable situations. Now, PFF basically tries to look at certain metrics that year to year we see far less volatility, and they are, I think, just, again, like the name says, more stable situations for evaluating quarterback play. So if you look at these 2 quarterbacks, the 5 metrics we use were PFF passing grade from a clean pocket, standard, easy, straight dropbacks in the pocket, passes on 1st and 2nd down, no play action, and throws at or beyond the sticks. And Dwayne, pretty common theme here. both these quarterbacks, they're in the freaking Super Bowl. They're fantastic. Matthew Stafford, you see him turning top 10 ranks and everything, but then you get to Joe Burrow. First in clean pocket PFF passing grade, first in standard dropbacks, first on first and second down, first on no play action, second when throwing at or beyond the sticks. I mean, if you just look at what Burrow's been able to do when we can take away the single kind of, biggest kryptonite from his offense being his offensive line, no one's been able to slow the guy down all season long.
Yeah, for sure. Just looking at this data, it's like, because I haven't looked at it this way. I mean, his number one ranks across all these areas.
It's ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. I guess, was it OBJ that put out the quote that, if you looked up the word cool, Joe Burrow is just going to be sitting there. I know that's another former LSU guy, but man, looking at this, it makes you definitely think that.
Now looking at throwing deep, and once again, both guys are absolutely fantastic. This time, though, it does seem like Stafford should get the edge. Raw yards per attempt, Matthew Stafford, league high 18.9 on the season. Burrow all the way down in 6th at 15.3. We also see a decent gap between the adjusted completion rate, too. So, again, both quarterbacks very good, but Matthew Stafford does get the edge here. And credit to him for staying hot in the playoffs. On passes thrown at least 20 yards downfield, he's completed 7 of 14 for 255 yards and a pair of touchdowns. Luckily, 0 interceptions. I know 49ers fans wish that would have been 1 at this point. Meanwhile, Joe Burrow, at least in the playoffs, Dwain, just 3 for 9 for 101 yards, 0 touchdowns, and an interception when throwing the ball at least 20 yards downfield. Burrow's been, he's been great all season long. I just said that as well. But if you look at kind of what he did at the end of the regular season, he had the 2 just massive blow-up games against the Ravens and then the Chiefs. Towards the end of the year, it's wow, we're hot, we're ready to go. Has that been skewing people's mind a little bit on Burrow? Because let's face it, it's not like he's coming to the playoffs and just week after week after week been putting up these huge gaudy numbers.
Yeah, but at the same time, I think, we could also argue that, he was coming off of a major injury. The offense began evolving, probably around week 14, really, to starting to throw the ball more. So it's almost like the coaches are seeing the same thing, right? They're getting more and more confident, in his capability, more confident, in his timing with his receivers. The other thing, is just as you play against a lot of he's recently played against more of these man coverage teams, and he's just fared really well against them. And I think a lot of it, it's obviously he's a component of it, but he just has 3 really good. I mean, I guess even Uzoma now is playing so well too. But if you think about Tyler Boyd, Jamar Chase, and then T. Higgins, who really has a better 3 than that? And if you're going to give them singles across the board, it's going to be kind of hard for a quarterback that as good as Burrow is to not find the right guy, because one of them is going to be open. You're going to get a mismatch. And so I think those are all factors that are coming together. So I don't think it's something that is just being blown out of proportion. I think that you saw Burrow evolving and the coaches evolving with him as the season went on.
And it's funny because Burrow last year statistically was one of the worst deep ball throwers. And, you change A.J. Green with Jamar Chase, and you see how that kind of has a little bit of an effect on the rest of the offense. Round 3, want to look at who is better when their receivers are already open. It goes to Joe Burrow in a bit of a landslide. League best PFF passing grade of 95.5 when targeting receivers deemed open or wide open. Stafford top 8 himself, but we really see the difference in adjusted completion rate where Joey Burrow, number 3, Matthew Stafford, all the way down to 16th overall in the league. And even throwing downfield, man, it just really accentuates the results. Joe Burrow, when throwing to open receivers at least 10 yards downfield, 54 of 63 for 1,395 yards, 22.1 yards per attempt, 13 scores, not a single interception on the year. Tough to stop Joe Burrow, really under any circumstances, particularly when one of his receivers is able to get open. And Dwayne, this is where we kind of see Burrow going on a little run here. I thought, starting this study, not really, I thought Burrow would probably win, but kind of once I got through 4 or 5 rounds, I was like, my God, is this going to be 11-1 or something? Because we look at who is better at extending the play. Doesn't, take a rocket scientist to figure out that one is Joey Burrow. Numbers on scramble rates tell us the same thing. And also as a rusher, who's better against 2 high looks? It's also Joe Burrow. 1 high looks, Joe Burrow. Well, against different types of coverages, it's all coming up Joe Burrow, Dwayne. Against cover 1, we've seen Stafford have the advantage, but cover 3, cover 2, cover 4, cover 6, it's just all Burrow. Really, man, the one big edge, we talked about Stafford getting the deep ball to his name, but Burrow obviously pretty good in his own right. The one edge, I think, comes down to how they deal with pressure and sacks, because that has been the problem with Burrow this year. We are able to kind of track certain things like how often our pressures actually converted to sacks, and that's the problem, man, with Burrow this season. The only quarterbacks that have actually allowed a higher rate of pressures to be converted into sacks, Zach Wilson and Baker Mayfield. Not exactly a great company that you want to be in. Matthew Stafford, far more respectable, 19th in that metric. So this is why with a lot of these, Dwayne, like I would look at the passing numbers, under pressure against the blitz and things like that. And Burrow was the better thrower, but sacks are a big part of this, man. I think there's something that, even though they aren't incorporated heavily into fantasy football, maybe they should be in the future, because, losing your yards on a sack, like how come we just say whatever? We don't even really record that as a play in fantasy. While if Joe threw the ball to the sideline, he lost 9 yards, obviously we would count that against him. So that was why, again, Joe Burrow would be ahead of Stafford in a lot of the passing metrics. But once we look at kind of offensive-wise success, like EPA per play and things of that nature, we actually see the Rams be better, because Stafford, to his credit, and the offensive line plays a large part in this, obviously, but they were better at avoiding those negative plays and pressures throughout the whole season. So, Stafford also, to his credit, third downs and in the fourth quarter and overtime throughout the year, narrowly edged Burrow. I thought it was interesting that Stafford, in the fourth quarter or overtime on the year, 13 touchdowns against just a single interception. Burrow, 10 touchdowns against 8 picks. And I even looked at situations, where they're tied or trailing, or just in the playoffs. Stafford has been the quote-unquote more clutch quarterback. Like, as much as we want to bring up, the Stafford dropped interception last week, Burrow had an equally horrendous potential interception dropped himself just a drive after he did throw a fourth quarter interception. So, Dwayne, when I got down to it, Burrow won 7 rounds to 5. I believe that's 115 to 113 if you want to go with the 10-9 boxing terminology there. But, I think it was a good way to quantify maybe what we already knew, that being both guys are great, but really, man, it's going to come down to if Joe Burrow can keep on overcoming the pressure in the offensive line, because at a minimum, man, Stafford and McVay, what they've been able to do with this Rams offense is provide a group that, even if they aren't quite as elite and exceptional as Burrow, it's a more complete overall offense that we've seen accordingly put up points fairly consistently all year long.
Yeah, with Stafford, can you do something with Cooper Kupp? Look, and Beckham Jr.'s been nice, but I know, you've looked at something similar to this, looking at, Jamar Chase versus Cooper Kupp. But Joe Burrow, yeah, it's just all about the blitz. Can they handle the blitz? But they just have too many good weapons. He's going to see a ton of zone coverage, this weekend, looking at, the Rams. And the Rams are interesting because they're one of these teams that really mix things up. Like, they're not just like, oh, yeah, we're a single high team, right? We're a cover 3 team. We're a cover, 4 team. Most teams are either, cover, most zone is cover 3 still in the league. But, man, the Rams are one of those teams that they truly mix in all of the different looks. You're going to see cover 6 one play, cover 4 the next, cover 2 the next 2. And you may not see cover 3, for 7-8 plays in a row. So the Rams are very good at mixing things up. They're also really good at trying to disguise. So if you can play all of those coverages really well, and you know that you're not going to, because the problem with zone coverage, and the reason some coaches don't try to use all of it, Ian, is because, if you give the guys too much, like what happens? What happens whenever, that's where you get the blown coverages, the blown assignments. But the Rams are one of these teams that they can actually execute on all of them. And so you really have to play on your toes whenever you're playing against their secondary. But at the same time, they're bringing that intense pressure. So that's kind of a tough mixture to have to play against. But again, for Burrow, fortunately, with 3 really good weapons, and we've seen here in the recent weeks, Burrow's just getting the ball out a lot quicker, right? He's just basically, you saw him in that Chiefs game change. He's like, okay, I'm just going to get it out. I'm just going to get the ball out, get the ball out, get the ball out. And you can do that when you've got 3 receivers like he has.
12 rounds. Joe Burrow, unanimous decision W over Matthew Stafford. Thought it might be a TKO. Stafford able to weather the storm, put up a good fight in his own right. You can catch that article on pff.com as always. Dwayne, fantastic stuff. We will be back on Friday with a nice little Super Bowl preview. You, myself, and Andrew Erickson going over some props, general matchups, all fun preview things of that sort. After the Super Bowl, we will be here getting feisty, all things Dynasty content. I'm going to finish off my ranks later this week. I know we've already been diving into plenty of that, and we have plenty more on the way. Also, we'll start to get into a little bit of best ball stuff. I had a few of you reach out and just ask about maybe getting some early thoughts on best ball. Definitely will. I think probably on these episodes moving forward, we can definitely devote a segment or two to it. But just so you all know, really trying to hit Dynasty the hardest in February. And then once March comes around and we get some of these free agents figured out, that's when as a team, we will be diving even more into best ball. So appreciate all you listening. Mr. McFarland, anything else you want to get off your chest?
No, man. No, this has been great. I've got to go back to spreadsheet land now.
My man is always grinding. I will get back to maybe finding a new computer so I don't look at a blank screen for like 30 straight minutes. So we will address that, watch the film, and get better. For Dwain, I'm Ian. Thanks as always for tuning in to PFF Fantasy Football Podcast. And until next time, take care, everybody.